The morning sun was barely a suggestion over the sprawling estate, a weak light that did little to warm the ancient stones of the palace. Inside, the world was a hive of hushed activity, a ballet of routine that had played out for centuries. And at the center of this world, navigating its currents with the practiced grace of a swan, was Camilla. She wasn't born to this life, not in the way her husband was. She came to it later, with the wisdom of years and the resilience of a woman who had weathered more public storms than a fleet of ships. The weight of her position was a physical thing, a beautifully tailored suit of armor she donned each morning along with her couture dresses and carefully selected jewels. She walked the long, tapestry-lined corridor towards the throne room, her footsteps silent on the plush runner. A lady-in-waiting, a sweet, nervous girl named Eleanor, walked a respectful 3 paces behind. Camilla could feel the girl's anxiety. Today was a reception for the Commonwealth diplomats, a parade of smiling faces and veiled political maneuvering. It was, to be frank, a bit of a bore, but a necessary one. For the king, it was a duty. For her, it was an art. She watched, she listened, and she remembered. In her mind, she cataloged the firmness of a handshake, the directness of an eye gaze, the slight tremor in a voice. That's where the real information lay, not in the carefully worded speeches. As they approached the gilded doors of the throne room, the noise level intensified. The low hum of conversation, the clink of a spoon against fine porcelain, the stifled laughter. A footman, resplendent in his scarlet livery, saw her coming and straightened, his white-gloved hands moving to the brass handles. But just as he was about to pull the door open, a side door, one used almost exclusively by staff, burst open. A man shot out, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He was a palace official, one of the mid-level administrators who ran the day-to-day machinery of the monarchy. His name was Alistair Finch, and he was clutching a piece of paper so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't looking where he was going. His focus was entirely on the document, his lips moving silently as he read it, a man possessed by a problem. He barreled directly into Camilla. It wasn't a gentle brush, it was a full-body collision. The impact sent a jolt through her, and she stumbled back a step, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Eleanor, the lady-in-waiting, let out a small, horrified squeak, but for a split second, time seemed to freeze. The footman's hands hovered in the air. Alistair Finch looked up from his paper, his eyes wide with the dawning horror of what he had done. He saw her, the queen, the king's wife, and for a single, fatal moment, protocol and sense abandoned him. Perhaps it was the stress of whatever was on that paper. Perhaps it was a lifelong prejudice that he thought he had buried deep. But instead of the immediate, profuse apology the situation demanded, his eyes flickered with something else first. A flash of irritation, a micro-expression of annoyance that he had been interrupted. It was there and gone in a heartbeat, but Camilla, who had spent a lifetime reading people, saw it. "Watch where you're going, man," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying the unmistakable timbre of authority. It was a reprimand, a clear signal for him to snap to attention and perform his duty. But Alistair, flustered and now defensive, mumbled, "My apologies, ma'am. Urgent business from the king's secretary." The words were correct, but the tone was all wrong. It was dismissive. "Ma'am," instead of "Your Majesty." Urgent business, as if her presence on this corridor was an inconvenience to his important work. It was the final, silent insult. The collision had already been a violation of her personal space and dignity. This mumbled, almost resentful excuse was an attack on her position. In that instant, a lifetime of navigating a world that had often judged her, whispered about her, and waited for her to fail, condensed into a single sharp point. Her hand, gloved in soft cream leather, moved not in a calculated swing, but in a swift and instinctive motion. It connected with his cheek. It wasn't a powerful, bone-jarring slap, but it was a slap nonetheless. A sharp, concise crack that echoed in the suddenly silent corridor. Alistair Finch recoiled as if he'd been burned. His hand flew to his cheek, his face a canvas of shock, pain, and utter disbelief. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes as round as saucers. The footman stood frozen, a statue in livery. The noise from within the throne room seemed to swell, a distant, oblivious roar compared to the deafening silence in that small, private space just outside. Camilla didn't say another word. She simply straightened her shoulders, smoothed the front of her dress, and nodded at the petrified footman. He fumbled for the handles and pulled the heavy doors open. She walked past Alistair Finch without a second glance, leaving him standing there, a stunned witness to his own catastrophic miscalculation. As she stepped into the throne room, the world shifted. The warm, golden light from the chandeliers washed over her. The air was thick with perfume and polite chatter. A sea of faces turned towards her, diplomats and dignitaries offering bows and smiles. She returned them all with practiced ease, her own face a serene mask. No one in this room knew what had just happened. To them, she was simply the queen consort making her entrance. But beneath the serene surface, her heart was a drum against her ribs. She had done something unprecedented. She, the epitome of composure, had struck someone. The metallic taste of adrenaline was sharp on her tongue. She found her place, and a few steps from the king's throne, and stood, her posture perfect, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. The show, as it always must, went on. She mingled, she smiled, she made small talk with an ambassador about his wife's recent charity work, all while a single burning question echoed in the back of her mind. When would he come? When would Alistair Finch come through those doors with his red cheek and his tale of humiliation? Her eyes, hidden in plain sight, kept drifting to the side door where the king would enter. He was late, which was unlike him. The minutes stretched, each one an eternity. The diplomatic reception flowed around her like a river around a stone. She was there, but she was not of it. Every nerve ending was tuned to the hum of the palace beyond these gilded walls. She pictured the scene. Alistair, finding his courage, marching to the king's private secretary, demanding an audience. She imagined the whispered conference, the looks of horror, the frantic debate on how to handle the situation. It was a scandal of epic proportions, a gift to the tabloids they so despised. The Queen slaps palace aid. The headline wrote itself. She felt a cold dread begin to creep into her stomach, a chilling counterpoint to the initial fire of her anger. Had her instinct, her fierce protection of her own dignity, just cost them everything? Then, a subtle shift in the room's energy, a ripple of anticipation. The main doors to the side of the dais, the ones reserved for the royal family, were opening. The king entered. He was a figure of immense dignity, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the room. He moved with a slow and deliberate grace, nodding to a few familiar faces. But as he walked towards his throne, his eyes found Camilla, and in that single glance, her world stopped. There was no anger in his gaze, no disappointment, no shock. There was only a deep, profound, and searching question. He knew. He already knew. The look said it all. It wasn't an accusation, but a quiet plea for understanding. What happened out there? He took his seat on the throne, the ancient symbol of his power and lineage. The room fell into a respectful silence, awaiting his first words. But the king said nothing. He didn't acknowledge the diplomats or raise his hand in greeting. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on his wife. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. A low murmur of confusion began to ripple through the assembled guests. The Lord Chamberlain, a man whose entire career was built on the smooth running of such events, looked on the verge of apoplexy. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, the king stood up from his throne. Not to make an announcement, not to greet a special guest, but simply to stand. He took a single step forward towards Camilla. The act was so utterly unprecedented, so flagrantly against every rule of royal protocol, that a collective gasp seemed to be sucked from the room. In a monarchy, the throne is the ultimate symbol. To rise from it in the middle of a formal reception, without a word, was to declare that something, or someone, was more important than the ceremony, more important than the tradition, more important than the assembled power of the Commonwealth. He had heard what happened. He had heard how his wife had been jostled and dismissed. And in that moment, surrounded by a room full of witnesses, he was making a choice. He was leaving the throne to stand by his queen. The room held its breath, the stunned silence heavier than any sound, as the king took another step toward Camilla, his intentions a complete mystery, his actions a silent, powerful declaration that was about to change everything.